Greetings and welcome to the Recombobulation Area. My name is Dan Schaefer. Thank you for joining us. Here at the Recombobulation Area, a staple of our coverage of politics in Wisconsin has been to write a deep dive breakdown and analysis of every new Marquette University Law School poll of Wisconsin voters. Our first one of those doing that was back in 2019. I was breaking down the Democratic presidential primary field and trying to figure out where Pete Buttigieg was finding support in Wisconsin. A little bit has changed since then, but Charles Franklin, the director of the poll, remains the leader of this gold standard poll in Wisconsin, and the first new poll of 2026 for Wisconsin voters was just released, and Charles Franklin is here to talk more about it with us today. Charles, thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the Recombobulation Area.
Thank you, Dan. It's always good to talk about these things.
Now, I want to start today by talking about a little bit more of a bigger picture topic, something that you discussed during the results presentation and also briefly with members of the media afterwards. You said, quote, "It used to be that all politics was local. Now all politics are national." I feel like this has never been more the case in any of the almost 7 years of polls I've followed than this one, and the political environment has been shifting this way significantly in recent years. Can you expand on what you mean by that statement and how it applies to these latest results?
Yeah, saying all politics is local is a Tip O'Neill quote that goes back to the 70s or 80s. It's a long ago quote. And I think that in that period, we were certainly divided by partisanship, but we weren't as deeply polarized as we are now. What we're seeing in this administration, but it's been building for a number of years, is that Republicans are really strongly united behind President Trump, still getting 85% of job approval from Republicans. But Democrats are even more awesomely repelled by him. We're seeing 95 to 98% opposition to Trump from Democrats across a variety of issues. If those two sides of the political conflict so dominate our consciousness that even the famously divided Democrats can unite on this one topic, I think it means that it's that much harder to think about crossover voting if you're a Democrat, or if you're a Republican, hard to think about crossover voting for a Democrat. And where that applies right now to where our attention goes is to the national level, where those divisions are just so prominent. They filter down to the state and local level, and they can be intense enough here in the state, don't get me wrong. But I do, and it's speculation, let's label it as speculation, but that maybe we really are paying a little more attention to the national dilemmas, and at least at the moment haven't tuned in to the state races. I guess we have to say the other thing, advertising in the Supreme Court race a year ago was already running full tilt by this time then. Advertising now is just beginning to trickle out, and it's certainly not as dominant as it was a year ago. And, it'll build between now and the April election, but I don't think we're going to see the saturation that we saw in 2025. So if you're a casual, occasional voter, one way you find out about polls, or not polls, but find out about elections, is these damned ads interrupt. You're watching and enjoying Jeopardy in the afternoon. And, if we're not saturating the airwaves with advertising on the court or other races at this point, maybe that's playing a role as well. I think the real proof of the pudding will be to come back in March, and let's see then whether people are still as tuned out as they seem to be at this point in the February poll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because part of the context in which you're discussing this is the fact that so many voters are undecided. And that was the first thing you mentioned at the, results presentation at Marquette University about how about 2/3 of voters
Yeah.
in the spring election, in each party's primary, are just not engaged with this at all. But you also are asking about a lot of these national issues, and people seem to have really strong opinions on what's happening in national politics, really strong opinions on the figures in national politics, but people are not as engaged on the state and local level. Obviously, like you mentioned, it's a little bit different than the state Supreme Court race that was here a year ago. That was, the first major state level election happening after Trump's return to the White House. So there was a ton of attention, ton of money getting poured into that. But I just feel like this poll showed so many examples of how, if people are paying attention to politics, and a lot of people tune out politics entirely in this day and age, if people are paying attention, they're paying attention to national politics, not the local politics.
And I think you actually see that in the data as well, in that on so many national issues, we see a Democrat and Republican split that is often 85 to 90% one way for Republicans and 85 to 90 or 95% the opposite way for Democrats. Even on fairly divisive issues here in the state, it's more often an 80-20 split or even a 75-35 split, 75-25 split, going in opposite directions. We are divided by our parties here, but it doesn't usually on state issues get up into the 90-10 splits in opposite directions. It's, a little less than that. And again, if you're paying attention to politics, maybe you go where you're attracted to the most gripping, most aggravating sort of divisions, and that could play a role here.
Do you think that trend, the overall trend of like how people are paying attention to politics, that all politics is local versus all politics is national, in your years observing this through all of the polling data, how has that trend really unfolded?
Well, you certainly see it in the partisan differences. The split between Democrats and Republicans is just bigger now on most issues, but especially on national issues than it used to be. Look, we're the state that went through Act 10 in 2011. So we know a lot about division. In fact, in many ways, we became a more polarized state than the rest of the country at that point. We preceded the Trump era in terms of deep partisan division. So nobody should think I'm saying that we don't have our own set of divisions. But we occasionally find an issue in which the parties are pretty much united. A big majority on both sides of the same issue, despite party differences. But that's become the exception rather than the rule. And certainly things like crossover voting is vastly smaller than it used to be. There was a couple of elections in the 1980s, in late 80s, early 90s, where both Republican Tommy Thompson won 60% majorities in an election, and Democrat Herb Kohl won 60% in the same election on the same day. So we certainly don't see those kinds of crossover voting occurring in the state these days. We have a Republican senator and a Democratic senator, but believe me, it's not because there's a whole lot of crossover of people voting for both Tammy Baldwin and for Ron Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also feel like you see some of the local issues. I think this especially pops on immigration, where you talk about just the way that people view these issues as a proxy of whatever candidate they might be in favor of. You see the poll results that you had on approval of how ICE enforcement has gone in recent months.
That's right.
Talking about the perception of whether the shooting of Alex Preddy was justified. Talking about the use of guns or the legality of guns at protests. So many of these issues seem to be trickling down from what's happening in the national conversations and not bubbling up from what's happening locally.
I think that's right. And I think the examples you cite, we see this extreme polarization with 80% plus of Republicans saying they approve of the job ICE is doing. 97 or 8% of Democrats disapprove. 75% of independents disapprove of how ICE is handling its job. So that's a great example where, of course, most of the issue and policy issue is coming out of Washington, coming out of the White House, not something that's bubbling up from the states. Actually, data centers, which I'm sure we'll get to, is one where there's less extreme division, but Republicans are 55% skeptical of data centers. Democrats are up pushing high 80s, close to 90% opposed. And that has really changed since October, when there was no partisan division on the issue. So that one, though, I think is not driven by the national issue. It's bubbling up from here in the state.
It has been. I guess we can get into that one now, because I'm really fascinated by that. You asked a lot of questions on data center politics, and that has really shifted from what was it? October was the last state level poll. So the last state level poll basically showed that the breakdown between kind of support and opposition to these data center developments did not cut along traditional political lines. You had kind of like a broad, kind of mild disapproval of these, and that was pretty similar across Republican, Independent, and Democratic voters. That shifted really significantly, particularly for Independent and Democratic voters in this latest poll.
Indeed, it was really astonishingly even in October, which was the first time we'd asked about data centers, so I can't go back any earlier than that. But in that October poll, the question we asked, do you think the benefits outweigh the costs, or the costs outweigh the benefits? But I'll simplify that and just call it support and opposition to data centers. It was 43%, 45 in favor, 55 opposed. But among Republicans, it was 53 opposed, Independents 55 opposed, and Democrats 56 opposed. I can't remember a question we've asked that was quite as even as a split on that on a public policy issue. But this time in February, first of all, overall opinion has gone to 29 in favor and 70% opposed, a huge swing. Republicans haven't moved much at all. They're at 45-53 now. But independents have gone to, 43-55 for Republicans. Independents have gone to 76% opposed, and Democrats to 85% opposed. I was talking to a fellow pollster about this, and we couldn't remember an issue that had changed this much in this short a period of time as what we're seeing on the data centers. And going from basically bipartisan mild opposition to now opposition across all three party groups, but much more opposition from independents and especially from Democrats now. So it really has taken the Democratic base, the rank and file voters, and moved them from sort of mildly opposing to really strongly opposed.
And you also talked about in this poll here some of the, some of what might be driving the answers about what are the costs that outweigh the benefit, or the costs and benefits, and where things really lie in this conversation. And so walk me through how you put that part of the poll together and
Sure.
how that really took shape in the results.
So first of all, I listened to what people were saying at community hearings on data centers. I looked at what some of the interest groups were saying and some legislators and what their arguments either for or against were. And I tried to distill it down to 5 benefits and 5 costs that were pretty widely being discussed. Now, I'll be the first to admit that's hardly everything you could see as either good or bad about data centers, but I thought it captured most of what I was hearing in that public discussion. So we gave people a list of these 5 benefits, and said, as you know, data centers come with both costs and benefits and with costs. Here are some things that people say might be benefits. Which two of these five do you think is most important as a benefit from data centers? Then we did exactly the same question, but now about the five costs. And the bottom line was the number one benefit that was cited was creating tech jobs, technology jobs, and other jobs related to data centers. Those are the sort of long-term jobs, not the short-term jobs. 44% picked that. Add new local tax revenue. That was second, with 35% saying that was most important. I was a little surprised that construction jobs come in third place at 25%. I thought since they're fairly immediate and visible jobs, they might be higher, but they weren't, 25. And then on the broader question of establishing a new industry in the state, just 21% picked that. And one argument that some have made is that we need to lead the world in artificial intelligence, and these data centers are necessary for that. Only 18% picked that. On the cost side, the number one cost that was picked out by 52% was high water use that would strain local capacity. The number two issue was that AI is bad. People opposed to artificial intelligence. And that, I think, is obviously the flip side of the very low rating as a benefit of leading the world in AI, is that a lot of people are pretty skeptical, if not outright opposed to AI. And so opposing the data centers is a reflection of that reluctance on AI.
I found that really interesting because I think that, if people can talk about like the environmental impacts and obviously utility costs and so many of these other challenges that when it comes to data centers that we're still trying to understand. But I think there's also an element here that is revealed in that part of the poll, whereas it is not just an infrastructure question, but it is a question about maybe these data centers being kind of a proxy for how people feel about AI more generally, and just like an overall broader backlash to the rapid adoption of this technology and the emergence of this technology. And it's hard, being as amorphous as it can be and so in impacting so many different industries. It's not just like, tech regulation or just infrastructure or whatever it might be. Is this being a proxy for saying, I'm not sure about this?
I think it is. I think it also reflects the unpopularity of big tech companies right now, which, used to be they were sort of the saviors of the modern economy, and now there's a lot of skepticism about them. We saw that of those people, and it was a majority of the public said that AI was moving too fast. 79% of them opposed data centers. Of those that said AI was moving at about the right speed or too slow, 45% opposed. So there's quite a gap there that's clearly related to AI. Unfortunately, I didn't have the gumption to ask about views of big tech companies or specifically companies like OpenAI. So I can't speak to whether that really reflects opposition to those companies as opposed to something more specific to artificial intelligence in a broad sense, the threat that it poses to jobs or other things. But there's no question that some of this opposition to data centers is rooted in opposition to artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. I want to come back to the costs, though, if I can.
Yeah.
Because I was a little surprised because cost of electricity, the idea that these data centers will use a lot of power and that'll drive up rates for everybody else. It was a concern, but only 35% picked that. That put it in third place. Another thing that environmental opponents raise is that this construction of big electric consumers would require us to build more power plants. And so they're worried that the environmental consequences won't be from the center itself, but from the power generation that you need to power them. 31% picked that, just behind the overall cost of electricity. And then the one that got the least concern was replacing agricultural or rural land with an industrial landscape. Obviously, people that think of these things as possibly going in their backyard are quite concerned about what that does to their local backyard. But it didn't turn up too highly or very highly at all in this. So water use clearly got through. I guess if you put the two electric things together, the cost side and the PowerPoint plant side, then that gets you over 60% mentioning that. But I do think they're separate issues. And again, in my listening to what people were saying, those were things that different people tend to bring up. People with a more consumer concern worried about electric rates, people with a more environmental concern linked it to power plant creation.
Interesting. Yeah, there also seemed to be kind of this regional component to this issue that I found interesting. It almost unites urban and rural voters, like not a lot of issues do in the state of Wisconsin, as that has been like kind of a main point of polarization in our politics over the past decade plus here is, and you saw some of the numbers. I think it was, you had basically 75% of Madison area voters opposed to data centers and 75% of the rest of state category that you include, which encompasses much of northern and western Wisconsin.
Right.
Also 75% opposed to data centers.
Yeah, there wasn't much variation there. Where opposition was a little bit lower was the Milwaukee suburbs, which are more Republican. And while a balance of Republicans are also opposed, it's not as intense as it is in deeply blue Madison area. But that doesn't explain the north and west of the state, which is ruby red for the most part. But as you say, equal opposition there. So less of a regional difference than we see on a lot of issues.
Mm-hmm.
It also suggests there's not a safe haven where data centers could go and be greeted with broad local support. It does look like they face opposition pretty much anywhere in the state.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how candidates running for governor approach this issue. Yes. And I'll try a clumsy segue here to talk about some of those primaries for governor as well. The overwhelming takeaway from this is that there are not that many people tuned in to what's going on in this primary. I think it was 2/3 of voters on the Democratic side did not have a preferred candidate as of yet in this race. And let's start on the Democratic side, because that's obviously where you have more of the candidates. And this is the first poll that includes former Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, whose entry in the race came after the October poll. And he is significantly ahead of the field in terms of name ID, but not ahead of the field in just terms of the overall preference. So how much does that name ID matter right now in a race like this? And what does it suggest to you that he was so far ahead in name ID, but not, one of the leaders in the poll, certainly, but not ahead of the field the way he is with that identification question?
I think that's exactly right. When he got in the race, there was all kinds of speculation that he would dominate the race because he had run and only lost by 1% to Ron Johnson in 2022, and that would propel him to front runner status. Well, name ID, meaning that they recognize the name and can give either a favorable or an unfavorable opinion, as opposed to saying, haven't heard enough. He's the leader there at 61%. That is down from 84% at the end of the Senate race, but that's normal. People peak, obviously, just before their Senate or other race. So he's got a big advantage there. Sarah Rodriguez was second in name ID at 33%, followed by Francesca Hong at 29%, David Crowley at 26%, and the others were all below 25% name ID. So you can see he's almost doubling the second place Democratic candidate in name ID. But on the vote question, it's actually Hong at 11, Barnes at 10, and Rodriguez at 6, and the others are all at 3 points or below. So it's just obvious that the name ID has not translated into a big lead. I should also say that among Democratic voters, Barnes has a very positive net favorability rating. So it's not like Democrats have somehow become unfavorable to Barnes, but it just hasn't translated to this point into making a choice. And if we kind of come back to what we started with, that people haven't tuned into the elections this year, maybe that makes sense. It's not that they are consciously thinking of Barnes as a possibility and saying, no, I don't know. It's that they just haven't paid any attention to the race yet. And so when we ask this question with 8 candidates listed, they kind of understandably go, well, I haven't decided about that. We asked a question about how much have you read or heard about the elections. On the Supreme Court, just 6% had heard a lot. But on the governor's race, only 8% had heard a lot. Hardly any more had heard of the governor's race than of the Supreme Court race. And in contrast to that, last year in February on the Supreme Court race, 39% had heard a lot. So this is not a low-key Supreme Court race and the governor's race looks radically different. Instead, it's a Supreme Court race and a governor's race that look radically different from what we were seeing in the court race a year ago. So, obviously, by the time we get to the summer and the primaries start to loom, these problems will take care of themselves. People will learn. But I think the bigger takeaway is that Barnes is not dominating the field as some had predicted, and that because it's such a flat field, I think there's still the opportunity for anyone to break out. Hong has been very pleased to be at the leaderboard here at 11%. I can point out that the margin of error is plus or minus 6, so there's not really much difference between 11 and 10 or 6 for that matter. Though anybody that's in first place deserves to get a chance to brag about it, no matter what the statistics say. But I do think that we're in a situation where this field is gonna wait a while to see if anybody distinguishes themselves, somebody that catches the attention of Democratic primary voters, especially somebody that has a breakthrough moment or finds an issue that can really galvanize the public. One of the problems I see for Democrats here is that when 98% of your party despises Donald Trump, I don't think it's too harsh a term to say despise in this context. How does any Democrat distinguish themselves by being more anti-Trump than any other Democrat? I just don't think that's going to be something that's useful for distinguishing yourself in this field. Now, with a big majority of Democrats opposing data centers, maybe that could at one point have been an argument within the party between, the sort of jobs and economic development side or local property taxes on the one hand versus the environmental and maybe big tech opposition. But now that the party base seems to be pretty unified on that issue, again, maybe that's taken away one possible area where you could see some distinctions between the candidates. So I'm glad I don't give campaign advice. It's up to them to figure out how to get that breakthrough moment, that breakthrough issue. But it's going to be necessary to rise above the others and move comfortably into first place. And I won't be surprised if that doesn't take until June or even July before it really starts to be visible. Looking at all of the past primaries since 2012, we often don't see a big rise in attention to the campaign until June.
So that's
but we're at a lower level now than we usually are. So yeah. Maybe that'll delay it or maybe it'll accelerate it. I don't know.
Yeah, I've wondered if, just the fact that we have the spring election, if that's, if people are waiting to get past that to really ramp up, any of certainly in terms of like the spending on any of these campaigns, if we're going to wait until, late April or further out into the spring, to see some of that really change. But like, it's hard to, and I've been writing these for a while now, and it's hard to really make sense of what it means when you have most of the candidates in single digits or barely above that, right?
Yeah.
And it's, it's much larger margin of error. It's really hard to kind of determine exactly where this is coming from and what to make of it all. I do find some of Francesca Hong's numbers interesting because one of the things that I observed in the early goings of the race is that, yes, she's a state representative from a very blue district, but she's going to work really hard. She's got that service industry restaurant chef background. She's going to make the rest of the candidates have to work harder. And that's one of the things that I think is we're seeing in this isn't necessarily suggesting that she is, the ascendant candidate in all of this. But I think the fact that she has, found some level of a constituency in the early going suggests that it's going to be incumbent on the rest of these candidates to maybe up their hustle a little bit more in this, right?
No, I think that's right. And, she has a very effective social media presence, at least the social media that I follow and you try to use for this. So it will be interesting to see how she does that. And, I don't count any of these candidates out, but I think she is demonstrating that she has a significant base within the party at this point when so many people have not yet chosen sides, at least.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about the other side of the primary then too. So we had Tom Tiffany is essentially the presumptive nominee at this point. He has gotten the endorsement of President Trump. His top opponent in the race, Josh Schoeman, dropped out when that endorsement came down. And yet, Tiffany has not consolidated the field, because if you're looking at Tiffany versus undecided as the real two factors in this race, I guess, most voters have chosen undecided. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that is back to this issue of people that just haven't tuned into the race much. I don't see any real evidence in our data that Republicans are rejecting Tom Tiffany. He has a very good net positive favorability rating, but he is below 50% on name ID. A little better than that with Republicans, but not a lot better than that. And so, I think it's just not having yet engaged with it rather than any kind of active rejection of him. You do occasionally hear some in the GOP wishing for another candidate to enter. As far as I know, there's not any likely entry sitting on the sidelines that seems about to come in, though. Remember, Tim Michaels got in late in 2022, so maybe you don't want to count it out. But, with Trump's endorsement, and I think and Schoeman dropping out of the race, I think that's a pretty strong indicator for him. Tiffany's ability to unite the party. His challenge will come in the fall when he also needs to win over a lot of independent voters. And given what we said earlier about polarization, we're not thinking there's going to be much of a crossover vote in either direction this fall.
Doesn't seem like it.
No, I think we could safely say that at this point.
Yeah. One of the things that I took note of as I was looking through some of the crosstabs on Tiffany's, in the primary and on favorability and some of those other things is, I would say a relative weakness in the Milwaukee area suburbs. He is a candidate from northern Wisconsin, 7th congressional district, the northwestern part of the state. That's where he's represented for really his political career in Wisconsin. And that is kind of a departure from where most Republican candidates in Wisconsin have come from historically, from, the WOW counties, the Milwaukee area suburbs in particular. You've got Ron Johnson from Oshkosh, you've had Eric Hovde from Madison, but you've got a lot of candidates over the years that have come from the Milwaukee area suburbs. Yep. What does that say to you about just kind of the realignment we're seeing in state politics?
Well, I think the real question will be whether the WOW counties, most importantly Ozaukee and Waukesha, that have been drifting away from the Republican Party, are they going to be attracted to Tom Tiffany, especially to the extent that his support from Trump is going to play a big role? And for that matter, his support as a member of Congress for Trump, his strong voting record in favor of things Trump has proposed. Is that going to be a hindrance for him? For perspective, Waukesha County used to routinely produce 65 to 70% Republican majorities. And in the 22 governor's race, that actually slipped to 59%. So it's still a Republican county, but it's nothing like the majorities that used to be there. Likewise, Eric Hovney did not run up anything like the usual Republican vote in Waukesha. And Ozaki's getting not quite to 50-50, but getting awfully close to it. Washington, the other of the WOW counties, has moved a little bit in a Democratic direction, but not as much as Waukesha and Ozaki. So in that sense, Tiffany's MAGA credentials may actually hold him down in this voter-rich, large population area in the WOW counties where voters have been drifting away from the GOP and giving these much smaller majorities there. There's a side issue, and that is that Tiffany's pretty well known in the 7th Congressional District, that northern and western part of the state that we talked about earlier. But he's not well known outside of his congressional district, and that's not unusual. In fact, even Paul Ryan, who was a major national figure, was much better known in his Janesville area congressional district. When we polled about him statewide, other regions of the state knew less about him by a fair margin. And if that was true of him, imagine for an ordinary congressman like Tiffany, he will have to spend time introducing himself to Republican constituencies in the Southeast and in the Northeast, the Green Bay area. He can't do it just because as a congressman, he's somehow automatically known around the state. That's just not true. That's where Barnes does have an advantage because he ran statewide 4 years ago. So he already has introduced himself around the state.
And you see that on the Democratic side, too. You know, David Crowley had a bit better numbers in the Milwaukee area. You know, some of the Madison area folks did better in Madison and so on and so forth. So I think the regional component of this primary is one that I'm going to be looking at closely as it unfolds. A couple other issues I wanted to talk about, too. You at the poll, you have often included these questions about the issue of deportations. And you have phrased this question in kind of two ways. And there are different results based on how you ask this question, and those trends have evolved over time. Can you break down that one for us?
Yeah. And it's deliberate. It's not an accident that we ask it two different ways. That was designed that way from the very beginning. We started asking it at the beginning in January of 2024. So the question's been around for a long time. So one question that we ask is, do you favor or oppose deporting immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally? Favor or oppose, period. Let me tell you the other question, and then I'll give you the results. The other question begins in exactly the same way, but then ends with including those who've been here for a long time, have jobs, and no criminal record. That's the only difference between the two. On the first question, 64% support deportations without any qualification or amendment to that question. But when we ask the second question, including non-criminals, that support drops to just 40% with 60% opposed. And we've seen that pretty steadily. We've asked it more than a dozen times now over the years. Support for the first question, just deportations, that's been in the high 50s to the low 60s since we first started asking it in 2024. The deport including non-criminals has been fluctuating in the mid 40s. This one at 40 is near the low end of support for that, though I think we've seen 40 once before in our previous polling. And in the national polling, we see a similar kind of an effect where we get nationally more like 55 to 58% in favor of the first question, but support for the second question down in the low 40s or even into the high 30s. Other people ask the questions in other ways. Do you think immigration enforcement has gone too far? Do you support the policy, but not the way it's been implemented? At the opposite end, do you favor deporting violent criminal immigrants? You can get 80% support for that. Do you support deporting 5-year-olds? Support will drop well below 40%. So it really is very dependent on how the issue is framed to voters, where they come down on this. In October, we asked a question in the national survey about what people thought about providing a path for non-criminal undocumented immigrants to get work permits to continue to live in the country and work. And we got 75% in favor of that question. So my point is just, you can't take any one immigration and especially deportation question and ask that and pretend that that captures the totality of how people feel about this issue. It very much depends on who they're thinking about deporting.
It's such an interesting one, and it really suggests to me that there is an opportunity for some persuasion here for Democrats. Because, and this is something I've been critical of Democrats of for a while, I don't really understand where they stand on immigration. And I'd be interested to see if you were to ask, in your polling, just an open-ended question, where does the Democratic Party stand on immigration? Part of me thinks that you would get 10 different answers from 10 different people. And some of the nuance in these debates about whether or not people have a criminal record, whether or not they have a work permit, all of these different aspects of this larger immigration debate is that I don't feel like, and this is just me soapboxing, I don't feel like Democrats have made a case for where they stand. And I think the poll results that you tend to see in this over time, because this is not just an isolated thing that you see, let's say in response to what's happening in Minnesota right now, in just a flashpoint here. This is something you've seen fairly consistently in these polls over the years. And it says to me that there is an opportunity for Democrats to go out there and make a case for something other than what they're seeing and have some nuance about it and not to shy away from the details.
Yeah, I think this has been a problem within the party in terms of you have a wing of the party that is strongly in favor of immigrant rights, that thinks calling immigrants illegal is something that shouldn't be said. But you also have a lot of blue-collar Democrats, including Hispanic voters, especially in the Southwest, who are actually pretty concerned about immigration or illegal immigration. And yet the party has found it very difficult to speak with one voice about these things. The one area where Trump consistently gets majorities approving of the job he's doing is on closing the southern border. People know that crossings at the border are dramatically down. It's a real policy success for him in that way. And people very much approve of that. Even among Democrats, you're getting substantial minorities that say they approve of how he's handled the southern border. When you shift it to how he's handled immigration, support goes underwater with approval in the mid 40s, 44, 45%, a little better than his overall approval, but not over 50% like with the border. And within the Democratic Party, support falls off substantially, though Republican support remains quite strong. So I think the political challenge for any Democratic candidate is how do you appeal to those independent voters who were worried about what they perceived as open borders and an influx of migrants across those borders, and yet not seem to have adopted the anti-immigrant, anti-humanitarian aspect of it, where Democrats have a much harder time saying we should turn away asylum seekers, we should not welcome newcomers to the country. You know, really honestly, if we go back and think about the immigration debate, George W. Bush was having this debate in 2005 and 6, which was sort of the last time a bipartisan group in the Senate tried to come up with some solution, comprehensive immigration reform. It failed miserably then when the parties couldn't agree. And we've just suffered ever since by not resolving the issue, and where the parties have not come up with any kind of unifying message that could get you 55 or 60 or 65% in favor of some set of policies and reforms that protect American citizens who are here and are in many ways justifiably concerned about their well-being and think that should be the priority, but without turning your back on human rights and our national heritage as a country of immigrants.
Mm-hmm. It's a tricky issue, but I think there's room for Democrats to try to do a little bit more in the persuasion game and figure out where exactly they stand for. I have one more question before we let you go. You've been generous with your time here, but one of the biggest stories in the country right now, and more of a national story, of course, has been the Epstein files.
Yeah.
And I have seen a number of folks go on, cable news or whatever it might be. Usually it's a Republican on cable news saying that like regular people don't care about this issue. Have you considered polling the Epstein files and to figure out to what degree regular folks care about this issue? Because just anecdotally, I think regular people care a great deal about this and how the powerful and protected class can evade accountability even when it's something as egregious as what we're seeing from these files.
Yeah.
Have you thought about polling that? I know you do national polling too, but as a Wisconsin issue.
I have not asked about it here in Wisconsin, but we've asked about it regularly in the national polling. And it is high up in what people have read or heard about. They are, in that sense, following the developments in both in the pre-release period when the administration was resisting releasing them, then in the post-release period. Attention has remained pretty high. It's not the highest level of attention, but it's by no means close to the bottom of attention either. It's also one of Trump's two worst polling areas. He got only 30% approval in our January national poll on handling the Epstein files. That was equal to the 30% he got on handling inflation. So it's an issue that has hurt him considerably. The one thing that is now more partisan is that before the release of the files, a lot of attention was coming on the right of those conservative right-wing podcasters and others who had been shouting conspiracy theory, release the files. Now it's Democrats that are more up on the Epstein files, more down on Trump. Republicans, after the release, became more approving of how Trump had handled the files. And so there has been a little bit of shift there, with now Democrats being the ones most exercised about the files. I do think the last point you mentioned, though, and that was the unaccountability of the privileged, of the wealthy, the fact that some are now being held to account on this.
More in Europe than America, though.
More in Europe than here, but we've seen resignations of various things, not prosecutions, but resignations in the last couple of weeks. I do think that some of the revelations coming out of that are beyond what Epstein did to children and are now, does it say about the people who associated themselves with him both early on and then after his conviction or plea bargain that landed him in jail, but then in his post-jail period, who continued to come and associate with him, socialize with him, even if that didn't involve them in sexual practices with young children. It says a lot about their integrity and the fact that this didn't seem to them like a giant flashing red light. So I do think that's something that's developing in the, whatever this is, second, third, fourth phase of the Epstein files.
Right.
There was the initial scandal, then there was the death, then there was release the files. Now the files are out there.
Some of them are
now
out there.
some of them are out there and some are heavily redacted. But my point is, and I think you nailed it, and that is, what does this say about that elite class of very wealthy people with influence, that this seems for a lot of them to have been something they didn't think twice about, at least apparently so.
Yeah. I would be interested to see, the degree to which people at the local level care about this issue.
Yeah.
And I would be interested to see if those presumptions that some of those folks are making on cable news and elsewhere, saying that regular people aren't focused on this, they care about the economy, they care about affordability, they care about their health care, whatever it might be, and not this. I would be interested to see some more hard numbers on where people see this as a priority issue.
It's a good question, and coupled with the growing plutocracy, the growing super rich as an element of our society and our politics, that's an obvious kind of connection that could be developed over the next year during the campaigns and maybe beyond.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, Charles. Well, you've been generous with your time and insightful as ever, as always. And I appreciate you so much for spending some time with us here at the Recombobulation Area.
Thank you. Enjoyed talking anytime.